Brothers and sisters, our New Testament reading today is from the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, and I'm going to read for you verses 30 to 40. This passage picks up in the middle of a story, a parable that Jesus is teaching, which ends with the words, "As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." It's a parable we've looked at many times before. The passage continues, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.'" This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So I want to talk a little bit about strangers today. We've been looking over the last several weeks in our online sessions at the big idea that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. You shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. And if you keep reading in Leviticus, you shall love the stranger. And then eventually, by the time we get to the New Testament, you shall love your enemy. And we've looked at the first few of those. How do you love God? How do you love your neighbor? How do you love yourself? But today I want to talk about how do you love strangers. So through this series of conversations, we've seen that one of the ways in which we welcome people into the church family is through baptism. And in baptism, a family is created, a new type of family that's in covenant with God, and the people are in covenant with each other. And we said, well, that's okay, but what's that supposed to look like? What's the family supposed to be? What's it supposed to do? That sort of thing. And we eventually concluded that the whole thing is about love. And we need to understand what love is when it's talked about in the biblical narrative. And we saw love as willing the good of the other. Willing the good of the other. And that love has but one source, which is God. God is love. But it has many expressions. You can express it by loving God back, by loving your neighbor, by appropriately loving yourself, loving the stranger, and so on. When we looked at how do you love God, about in the we saw narrative, and we saw love as cultivate an attitude willing the good of and you do that through what are called works of piety, which can be and that love individual or communal, and it's all about learning to be grateful and how to express gratitude and where to direct it. And then when it came to loving neighbor, we saw what I thought was an interesting little twist. In the Old Testament, Hebrew words that are translated into English as neighbor, I think without fail, refer to a fellow member of the covenant community that belongs to God. In other words, a neighbor is part of the in crowd with you. Now, when John Wesley read that, he didn't see that as a restrictive thing. He believed it was a seed that the people of God started way back in history by learning to love their neighbors inside the covenant. But as time went on and the faith exploded all the way across the Mediterranean basin, people became followers of Jesus, that ultimately this idea of neighbor came to mean everybody else. So he famously would say, the world is my parish. Not just the people inside the church, but the whole world here. And so there's a transition in thinking about what is a neighbor. In the earliest of times, it started off with people who were in the in-group, and eventually it grew and expanded to mean everybody, at least according to John Wesley. And we looked at 10 ideas for loving your neighbor in one of our sermons. It was particularly tricky because we weren't meeting in person. And so my question was, well, how do you love your neighbor in a virtual space? What does that even look like, to love your neighbor who might be on the other side of the world, maybe listening through a translation device? You're never going to meet the person face to face. How do you love them? How do you will the good of the other? So we looked at some ideas for that. And then we looked at loving the self. You should love your neighbor as yourself. So what does that mean? Well, Wesley always interpreted this in terms of holiness. He says in his sermon, God's Love to Fallen Man, the more holy we are upon earth, the more happy we must be, seeing there's an inseparable connection between holiness and happiness. So if you want to be happy, loved, holiness is the way to go. And he said the way in which you do this is through self-examination and reflection, and holding each other honestly accountable, exercising love as an act of the will. Remember, if it means to will the good of the other, it's something you choose to do. It's not an emotion or anything like that. And we looked at some of Wesley's very famous 21 questions for accountability. They're a real gold mine if you're thinking about honesty, accountability, and self-examination. He asks very, very tough questions. And so we saw you can get better at loving God, you can get better at loving your neighbor, you can get better at loving yourself in a balanced way, not something that on one extreme is narcissism and on the other extreme is self-loathing, but finding the happiness is holiness place somewhere in the middle. And so I wanted to look today at the next piece, which is loving strangers. Now, some of you have heard me say before, this is hard, because the reason we call them strangers is because they're strange. They're different. That's what it means. We're talking about loving somebody who's different, and that's hard. And some of us are old enough to remember when stranger danger was a slogan. Yes, stranger danger, be careful, say no to strangers, keep away from them. And this idea that strangers are dangerous, of course, can be a very real one. But it's very much not the case that all strangers are dangerous, right? So how do you know, particularly if you're a small child, where you must err on the side of caution when it comes to strangers? So what is a stranger anyway? We see in Deuteronomy chapter 10 that God talks a lot about loving strangers. So we see the passage where it begins with the Lord your God and goes on to say, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for, and then there's a little list: orphan, widow, who loves the strangers, provides them with food and clothing. So strangers belong in the same group as orphans and widows. And you know that orphans and widows is a way of saying those who have no power. Widows didn't have any power back in the times when these texts were written. Orphans didn't have any power. Well, nor do strangers. And God reminds the people of Israel that there was a time when they were strangers. They were strangers in the land of Egypt. They were a small minority amongst a big majority. So this is a little language lesson here. In the Hebrew Bible, the word most commonly translated into English as stranger is the Hebrew word gur. It's a bit like the sound we would make if you were saying, what does a growling animal sound like? You went gur. That's the word, gur. And if you were to look up, well, what is a gur? And go into the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, you will see it says, as you can read, A ger is somebody who's left behind everything, their village, their tribe, and so on. Why? They've left it behind because there's war or famine or epidemic, we might say pandemic. Blood guilt, it's not such a common idea these days, but it means if you've had a falling out with a family and they're after you for something you may have done to somebody in the family. And this person is seeking shelter and residence in another place where they don't have any rights. Maybe they've gone to another country, say. They have no rights. They've just come into the country. They're not what we might think of as, say, registered to vote or anything like that. Maybe they have no documents. So their rights and liberties are all curtailed because they've had to go to a new place. Why did they go? War, famine, epidemic, blood guilt, these sorts of things. So today, the closest word really we have in English for someone who does that is refugee. Somebody who is fleeing to another country or place, trying to get away from danger, persecution, disease, and so on. And when they wind up in the new place, they find themselves with a lot less rights than they used to have in their old place. So there's the refugee idea here. And we see then that these refugees are widows and orphans. And the Hebrew Bible pays special attention to those who have no voice, widows, orphans, strangers, ger, refugees. Strangers are part of that group, the powerless here. In fact, the strangers are those who, in the lexicon, it says that their right of landed property, marriage, taking part in jurisdiction, cult, that means religious gatherings, war, and so on, all of that's curtailed because they had to flee to a different place where things are done differently. The idea in the passage that we looked at, we're told we're charged to love strangers. So will the good of the other, how do you do it? Well, the example given is providing them with food and clothing. In other words, caring for them and looking after them. So providing for strangers, ensuring they're treated justly, giving voice to them because they're powerless and so on. These are all ways that the Bible teaches us to love strangers. Now, interestingly, as you keep reading through the Bible, eventually you get done with your Old Testament, you turn the page, and you got to the New Testament. And what we don't notice if our Bible is like this one, and it's written in English, that really, with the turn of a page, you go from an ancient text written in Hebrew to an ancient text written in Greek. We can't tell because it's all been translated into English, but that's what's happened. And these are two completely different languages. They're written in different directions on the page. They use different alphabets, different grammars, and so on and so forth. In the New Testament, you will see lots of mentions of strangers. For example, Matthew 25 tells a story, and where we're told, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. It's Jesus saying that. And you think, stranger, refugee? Is he really a refugee? When was it we saw you a stranger and welcomed you? Even his followers are a little confused, right? And the king says, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. So what's the stranger business look like in the New Testament? Well, you can go and read about that. The Greek word that's most commonly translated stranger is xenos, from which we get the English word xenophobia. So fear of that which is different, right? And it seems that Jesus has brought about a kind of transition in understanding. You have somebody who in the Old Testament is a stranger in the sense of being a refugee, but Jesus says you should welcome them as a stranger in the sense of xenos, which really means guest. So there's a refugee, goes into a funny place, doesn't know what's going on. There's you. You're to welcome them as a guest. And a guest puts a whole different light on it, doesn't it? There's a transition here from one language to another. And the choice of words, I think, really matters. So in the Old Testament, we have the ger. Commandment refers to caring for what we would think of as refugees. But in the New Testament, Jesus says, how about you look at them as guests, as xenos, not as people who have just sort of blundered into your place, but people who you can extend hospitality to, who you can care for, who you can look after, the way you would a guest who showed up, who you'd invited to stay at your home for a few days. So the movement from stranger to guest, I think, is a very, very important one. And it's one of the ways in which Jesus kind of rethinks some of the structure of his own society. And I wanted to just take a quick look at these two categories, stranger, guest. So let's look at stranger. If we look at the world today and think of strangers as refugees or what are called displaced persons, people who study this have a technical difference between a refugee and a displaced person. To us who are not experts in the field, it all looks the same. They're all people who've been driven away from home because of war or famine or whatever it is. So how many are there, and where do they come from, and where do they go? How old are they? And all, lots of questions we could ask. We don't have time to ask and answer all of them. But how many are there? Well, according to one study here, we have in 2020, there were 82.4 million refugees and displaced persons in the world. That's a truly gigantic number of people. It would be, what could we compare that with? We could compare that very roughly with the population of Germany. It's very roughly, something like that. So it will be like everybody in Germany sets off to go somewhere else at the same time. All of them at once are looking for a new place to go. That's a huge number of people. And where do they come from? The country of origin. Well, the biggest country of origin, the bar across the top, you might not be able to read it, is Syria. Syria has more refugees and displaced persons than any other country. And then it's Venezuela, Afghanistan, Southern Sudan, and so on. But Syria is the one at the moment that has the most displaced people and refugees. So, where do they go? People are often concerned that they're all showing up at the borders of the United States. Gigantic numbers of people running away from war and showing up on our borders. But in terms of people who are hosted per capita of the population of the country, we see that the top country is Aruba. You're like, what? Where is that? I've never heard of that. And the second is Lebanon, and you work your way all the way down the list. Uganda is the bottom one on this list. The US doesn't make it by a long way to this list. So the idea that there are huge numbers of Syrians lining up at the borders here and coming into the country is really fiction. It's not real. There are huge trying to get into the country there. So how old are they? Well, one report says out of that 82.4 million people, they count 26.4 million as refugees, and the rest they count as displaced persons. To us, it all looks very, very similar. Half of them are under the age of 18. So we're talking huge numbers of children, huge numbers. And what are they running away from? I wanted to take a minute and just take one example so we can see. This is a map of Syria. Down here is Damascus, which is the capital city. Up there is Aleppo, which you may have heard of, which is, I think, the second most populous city. And the one I want to look at is this town here called Homs. Yeah. It's a pretty big city. Before the Syrian war, Homs, there were a lot of industry going on, lots of shops, lots of houses. Population was around 650,000. For comparison, Toledo has a population of about 270,000, so more than twice the size of Toledo. The actual city of Homs would be about the same size as Toledo plus all of its suburbs, very roughly here. And so what were they running away from? Why did all of these people decide to leave? Why would we consider getting up and leaving Toledo, just walking away, leaving it all behind? This is what Homs looks like now. Somebody flew a drone camera through the streets of the city. Remember, it was a major industrial center, lots of factories, lots of shops, apartment complexes, and so on and so forth. And this is what it looks like now. The little video clip's about 2 minutes long, but I think it's worth watching just to get a sense. One thing you notice almost right away is that there's essentially no traffic and no people, right? Absolute destruction everywhere. And as you can see, the city is huge, absolutely enormous. So I just wanted you to see that when sometimes we might think people show up on the borders of another country because, you know, they see more opportunity. Perhaps they want to get a better job or a better apartment and so on. That's certainly true of many people. But lots of people are refugees because of what we just saw. Their entire city has been completely destroyed. It's just rack and ruin. There is nowhere to be anymore. And so these are the folks who are refugees. And Jesus says, how about we transition our understanding of refugee into an understanding of guest? And a guest, of course, is somebody who shows up, but then you make space for them. You welcome them in, don't you? You invite guests to join in with things that are important to you. You look for opportunities to be invitational and welcoming, greet them. You have to, of course, be open to new encounters when you do that. So it could well be that somebody who is transitioning from refugee to guest, maybe, say, their eating habits could be completely different to yours. Things that you eat that they would think, ugh, who would eat that? And then you see them eating something and you think, good heavens, I didn't know people even ate that. So you have to be open to new encounters. And so one of the big questions here is, if we were to make an assumption, which could well not be true of this group of people, but the assumption that many of us have never met a refugee from a place like Homs, let's just pretend that that's the case for a minute. The question would be, is it even possible to love somebody if you don't know anything about them? You don't know them at all. How do you love somebody like that here? Now, we've already seen that there are ways that you can learn to know a little bit about God. Nobody can know God completely, but you can know a bit about God through works of piety, scripture and prayer and fasting and Bible study and so on. And you can turn that into love of God by transitioning into an attitude of gratitude. What are you grateful for, and how will you direct that gratitude? You can learn to know your neighbor. We looked at 10 ideas for getting to know your neighbor. And once you know them, it becomes easier then to extend benevolence and hospitality to them, because you know something about them. And even with yourself, knowing yourself is something that John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was very big on. As you know, he came up with his 21 questions to help us examine ourselves, be honest with ourselves. And the more we know ourselves, the more we can care for ourselves in a fair and reasonable way. So then we come to the refugee. How do you know the refugee? Well, one way is to do some homework, being informed about the refugee situation as it stands today. You know, some of the things that I showed you on the slides, they were not hard to find. And loving the refugee will be about advocating for justice and providing what is needed. Remember the passage in the Bible that says, how about you give them some clothes, some food, things like that. And then as we transition from thinking of refugees to thinking of guests, knowing guests means meeting people, greeting them, talking with them when they're outside your circle, and then being invitational and hospitable to those so that you can welcome them into your circle. That seems to be the transition that Jesus is most interested in. He acknowledges that there are people who are fleeing horrible situations, but he says, let's not keep thinking of them as refugees. Let's think of them as xenos, as guests, as an opportunity for us to show love. Remember, when we think of love, we're thinking of the one source. God is love. And then we can express it in these many different ways. You love God, you love your neighbor, as you love yourself, you love the stranger. So, loving the stranger, I think, is important. In the world today, we have, as you saw, over 80 million people fleeing situations like the one that we saw in the video. They're really refugees. But wouldn't it be nice if we could learn to think of them as guests? It seems to be the charge that Jesus has laid before us. Not so much a refugee, more of a guest. Not so much a problem, more of an opportunity for us to spread love in the world. Love the stranger. It's an important message.